Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is physically located at 4700 Grover Avenue in Northwest Austin. For more information about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today's speaker is Bob Jensen, who's a University of Texas journalism professor. He will be speaking on the topic of the politics of patriarchy and the corrosive culture of male dominance. Bonnie Gardner will now introduce Dr. Jensen.
Good morning, everybody. Today's speaker is Dr. Robert Jensen, and speaking again on the politics of patriarchy and the corrosive culture of male dominance. Dr. Jensen is going to analyze a long history of institutionalized male dominance in U.S. politics and culture. Similar themes have been increasingly part of our public discourse since the run-up to the November 17th U.S. election, and have been highlighted in many public demonstrations around the country. And he has a new book, The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. And he asks one key question: what do we need to create and maintain stable, decent, human communities that can remain sustainable in relationship with the larger living world? And his answer is radical feminism, which critiques institutionalized male dominance and rejects men's assertion of a right to control women's sexuality and reproduction, and demands an end to men's violence. Just very briefly, Dr. Jensen, as you know, teaches at UT School of Journalism. He has authored one book, Plain Radical, Living, Loving, and Learning to Leave the Planet Gracefully, and a number of other books. He's written quite extensively on topics such as institutionalized racism and white privilege, pornography, the risks of unfettered capitalism, and radical activism. He's also done documentary films on the life and philosophy of a longtime radical activist, Abe Osheroff. He's a board member of Third Coast Activist Resource Center for Austin and a national group, Culture Reframed. He's involved in a lot of political activism himself. Dr. Jensen is often very thought-provoking and can be controversial at times. I want to say that we have received some well-thought-out objections from ATX resist groups at UT regarding some of his commentary on transgender issues, and these were painful to the transgender community. We have asked the transgender and ATX resist community to put on a forum in May where they can present their perspectives on these issues. So again, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jensen willing to speak with us, and let's give him a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to reuse a joke that I've used now several times. The observation that I get invited to speak a lot, I rarely get invited back. And First Year U has had me back more times, literally, I think, than I can count. So it's great to be back. It's always a lively discussion. The book that Bonnie mentioned, The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men, to take the title of this new book as a kind of roadmap to what I want to talk about. First of all, the term patriarchy is not one commonly used today, but it's important. And so we'll try and do a little definitional work on what that means. The end implies that I believe it's a system that needs to end. We'll talk about why. Feminism as the vehicle for challenging patriarchy, especially what traditionally has been called radical feminism. Again, we'll do some definitional work about that. And I'll also speak a bit about why I think this is important for men. And that's probably where I should start, because there is always a bit of irony of a man standing up to talk to a group, especially a group with women, about feminism. So I want to make it clear what I think I'm doing and what I've been doing for about the last 30 years that I've been involved in a feminist project. It's not my job to explain to women how they should feel about their lives and about the world. It's not my job to tell women anything. What I try to articulate is what I have learned from women in feminist movements, both political movements and intellectual movements, how I've come to understand the world and understand myself as a result of feminism. The other thing we should probably get out of the way is at least a recognition of the recent presidential election and perhaps how the term patriarchy came back into the fore as a result of that election. Obviously, I wrote this book before the election. It came out in January. And so I didn't write it with the current president in mind. But in a sense, that doesn't really matter, because even if the election had turned out differently, I would still be arguing we live in a patriarchal society and that feminism is the appropriate vehicle to end that. In other words, the election of the first female president would not have changed in any way, really, the argument I'm making in the book, in the same sense that the election of Barack Obama didn't magically end white supremacy, that these systems of unearned privilege and power have existed for centuries, millennia. They endure even when those systems morph, change, adapt, and allow certain kinds of challenges. So patriarchy seems particularly compelling as a subject today, given who's in the White House. You'll notice I haven't mentioned a name yet. The name will not be mentioned during this presentation, at least. So let me start by talking a bit about how I got into this. I went back to graduate school after a career in journalism in 1988 and went back to study media law, media ethics. I was interested in the First Amendment. And one of the first things I bumped into was a feminist analysis of First Amendment doctrine. Now, at that time, I already knew, I was 30 years old, and I already knew a lot about feminism. I knew that feminists were ugly women who couldn't get dates. That was a joke. I'm kidding. What I mean is what I knew was nothing. All I knew was what the dominant culture had trained me as a man to think. And that's the kind of attitude I had. Right. So it was at the age of 30 that I had to start taking seriously feminism. I read work by feminists. I met feminists, both feminist intellectuals and activists. I took courses in feminism. And that idea I had going into it didn't survive the first page of a feminist text. What I realized is that I had been trained to be afraid of feminism. Whatever feminism was, whatever feminists were, I had been trained to be afraid. And that kind of fear often leads to mocking. But it didn't take long for me to realize that feminism had something to say, not only about the structure of the world, but about my own life. And that really isn't that surprising, because while today I'm a sort of average-sized adult male, growing up I had been very short, very skinny, and very effeminate in traditional terms. I was the kid who spent most of his time working not to get beaten up. I was the kid who clearly was never going to be a real man. So I had a stake in trying to understand the politics of those gender norms. And so feminism spoke to me fairly quickly once I got past the distortions about it. But what's interesting is the more I worked on feminist projects and talked to men, the more I realized that virtually all men, maybe all men, literally all men, at some point in their lives feel like they aren't man enough. That even the quintessential high school quarterback, prom king, good-looking, athletic guy, even the guy who seemed to meet the very rigid gender norms in masculinity in a patriarchal society, even that guy was racked by a kind of insecurity about not being man enough. And that's to sort of telegraph the end, that's why I think feminism, especially radical feminism, is not only an incredibly compelling way to understand the condition of girls and women in the world today, especially the injuries visited upon girls and women in a patriarchal society, but it also helped me understand myself. That's a way of saying that embracing a feminist critique of patriarchy, I think, is always compelling from the point of view of justice. That is to say, if we actually hold the moral principles we claim to hold about the inherent dignity of all people, the subject of today's sermon here at First UU, that if we claim to hold those principles, then we should embrace a feminist challenge to patriarchy because it's in the interests of justice. But of course, people in positions of unearned privilege and power don't always embrace those kind of arguments. So I also think it's important for men to make the argument there is a self-interest in embracing a feminist critique. That there's something on the other side if we can work through a challenge to those very toxic masculinity norms. One way of saying this is simply that I was raised to believe feminism was a threat to me. Whatever feminists were after, it wasn't going to be good for me. And what I came to understand through actual engagement with feminism is that it is a gift to us, to men. So that's a bit of how I got into this position. As I said, let's go back and talk about what some of these terms mean, because a lot of the confusion and disagreements, I think, often come in this realm because of a lack of clarity about definition. So let's start with patriarchy. Patriarchy, which literally means the rule of the father, is used not just to describe the relationships within a family, of course, but really as a term to signal institutionalized male dominance, any society that is structured on male dominance. Let me just read you a few definitions of important feminist writers that I think helps us understand this. Gerda Lerner, the late historian who wrote an important book called The Creation of Patriarchy, defined patriarchy as the manifestation and institutionalization of male dominance over women and children in the family, and the extension of male dominance over women in the society in general. She pointed out that doesn't mean every woman is powerless, that every man in every situation dominates every woman, but we're talking about patterns and systems. Here's another definition from a contemporary sociologist, Alan Johnson. A society is patriarchal to the degree that it promotes male privilege by being male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. Once again, male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. If you're like me and getting old and having memory problems, that makes a nice acronym. Male-dominated, that's a D. Male-identified, that's I. Male-centered, that's C. Never mind. Helps me remember it. One more quote, this from a contemporary historian, Judith Bennett, who wrote a good book called History Matters, Patriarchy and the Challenge of Feminism. She said, almost every girl born today will face more constraints and restrictions than will be encountered by a boy who is born today into the same social circumstances as that girl. And that's important. Let me repeat that. Every girl born today will face more constraints and restrictions than will be encountered by a boy who is born today into the same social circumstances as that girl. Obviously, there are other systems of power that affect our life outcomes. We talk about them routinely: race, gender, class, national origin. how our lives are going to play out depends on a lot of things. What Judith Bennett is saying is you take a boy and a girl in the same social circumstances, and that girl will face more constraints and restrictions. You can reflect on your own lives. It's if you've had siblings of the other sex, did that sibling have the same experience as you? It's very easy to figure out. All right. So patriarchy, right? It's this long-standing system. It goes back maybe 6,000, 7,000 years. People argue about it, in which men claimed ownership over women. That's the core of patriarchy. Men's claim of ownership over women's bodies, over women's reproductive power and women's sexual power. Now, that plays out differently across time, and it plays out differently from society to society. I would argue that the United States is a patriarchal society in 2017. I would argue that Saudi Arabia is a patriarchal society in 2017. They don't look the same. Patriarchy plays out in different ways. But I don't know a way to understand the contemporary world without that concept of patriarchy. I often use this analogy. There's a famous line in evolutionary biology, some of you may have heard, from one of the leading 20th century biologists, who said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution." And I would say the same thing. Nothing in contemporary sex-gender politics makes sense except in the light of patriarchy. That's central to understanding. All right, the end of patriarchy. A feminist movement is required for that. What do we mean by feminism? For me, and I'm just going to talk about how I came to understand this, feminism is clearly a critique of men's subordination of women. Right? So feminism helps us understand in patriarchy how institutionalized male dominance works. But for me, it's not only a critique of the unearned power and privilege of men, it's also a larger critique of hierarchy and the domination-subordination dynamic that structures so much of our lives. Now, feminism is not the only way to come to recognize the prevalence of hierarchy in our lives. For me, it was the first door I opened that shined a light on these power dynamics. Other people come to these observations through critiques of white supremacy or capitalism or Western imperialism. But feminism is not simply a critique of men's power, it's a critique of the illegitimate structures of authority that come with hierarchy. And always, I think, keeping an eye on not only the question of sex gender, but all these other questions as well. Also for me, feminism is both a political and an intellectual enterprise. In other words, feminism is a way to understand the world analytically. It's a way of thinking about the world. And it's also a political project to try and change the world. So to me, feminism is not the only tool needed to understand why the world works the way it does, but it's an invaluable and essential tool to doing that. Now, I said that the feminist position I've worked out of is called radical feminism, and there are some in the room old enough to remember back in the 70s the myriad divisions of feminism. There was socialist feminism and Marxist feminism and psychoanalytic feminism and cultural feminism. There were many, many terms used to describe feminism. Today, I think we've been reduced in some sense really to two different types of feminism: liberal feminism and radical feminism. And I would use the term liberal here as a kind of catch-all, not liberal obviously in the traditional political sense of, only the Democratic Party, but liberal and radical in the foundational ways that liberal critiques tend to take as a given the system and work within that system to try and produce the most equitable outcomes possible. Radical critiques tend to look at the nature of the system itself and ask about transcending it. That's a very shorthand and very simplistic way of thinking, but we can go into that more when we open it up. But the radical feminist critique is quite different than traditional liberal feminism. Right. So Hillary Clinton, to the degree Hillary Clinton ran a feminist political campaign, and I don't think it was too much of a degree at all, it would be traditional liberal feminism. A radical feminist perspective is quite different. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about radical feminism and making a reference to Andrea Dworkin, whose book Letters from a War Zone was particularly important to me. Came out in 1988, the same year I started graduate school. And Andrea is often one of the handful of women who are really define radical feminism of the last half of the 20th century. Andrea died in 2005, and I think it's always important to keep her memory alive. Andrea wrote once that feminism, the radical feminism she endorsed, is a movement against suffering. Now, she pointed out that we live in a culture in which suffering is meant to be immediately suppressed, repressed, pushed to the margin. We live in a society that tells you if you're feeling bad, all you have to do is go buy your way into happiness. And Andrea said that feminism required that you feel the pain, not repress it. She said one of the things the women's movement does is to make you feel the pain, which may seem counterintuitive at first, but I think everybody who's lived through something painful knows that ignoring the source of that pain rarely provides much relief, that it's the struggle to work through that source that really does take us somewhere. So radical feminism has never shied away from talking about the ways in which in contemporary American culture that pain is all around us. Radical feminists routinely have a very sharp critique of men's attempts to control women's reproductive rights. That's also true to a large degree of liberal feminism as well. The place where liberal and radical feminism tend to have diverged is primarily on the question of pornography and prostitution, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. But the way that men claim to own women's bodies for sexual pleasure. Right? But radical feminism always goes to that fundamental nature of the bodily history of patriarchy, men's attempts to literally claim to own women's bodies, especially women's reproductive and sexual power. So I found myself, again at the age of 30, stumbling back into graduate school, being exposed not only to feminism, but to this radical feminism, and finding it to be an incredibly compelling way not only to understand the world, but also to understand myself, to understand not only the injuries visited upon girls and women in a patriarchal society, but to understand my own struggles within that same patriarchy. So after working through these kind of questions in the book, I then take up three issues where there are often contests within feminism. One is on the question of rape and sexual assault, not whether we endorse it or not, obviously, but how do we understand where rape and sexual assault come from? What are the sources of those problems? Then I move on to talk about pornography and prostitution, what I tend to call the sexual exploitation industries. And then finally, as you saw evidence of, the most controversial chapter, which is the chapter on transgenderism, where I try to articulate in plain language a way that radical feminists for now more than 30 years have tried to question not trans people, but the underlying ideology of transgenderism. I thought for purposes of this rather short time we're together, I would just explain the question of pornography and prostitution real quickly, and then we can come back to anything you want to talk about in the discussion period. So the radical feminist critique of pornography and prostitution, or the sexual exploitation industries, makes it clear that pornography, prostitution, you could include stripping in this as well, are ways that in patriarchal societies men routinely buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. A radical feminist analysis challenges men's right to buy women that way, and liberal feminists have largely avoided that challenge or actually embraced the concept of choice within pornography and prostitution. So it's a hot button issue. For 30 years, that's been the thing people got most angry at me at until recently. So in the book, I ask two basic questions. Let me take them up. Focused first on prostitution, or what some people would call sex work. The radical feminist analysis doesn't use the term sex work, doesn't turn the buying and selling of human bodies for sex into routine work, but talks instead about women who are prostituted. There's a lot of debate about choice, and we can, again, take that up if you want to in the discussion. But in the book, I just ask one basic question. If we all have a shared goal of justice, especially in this realm, gender justice, that is, we want to transcend patriarchy. We want some world in which girls and women don't face the threats they face today and can really embrace not only full citizenship, but full humanity. Right? That's the goal. Let's call that gender justice. Can you imagine a society ever achieving anything like gender justice if one group of people, that is, girls and women, can be routinely bought and sold for the sexual pleasure of another group, men? Can a society ever achieve anything that would resemble meaningful gender justice if there is always going to be one group of people that can be bought and sold for the pleasure of another? I cannot imagine a society ever achieving that kind of justice as long as that condition is in place. So independent of the choice of any individual in the system, that condition, it seems to me, enhances and reinforces patriarchy. And that's the fundamental radical feminist challenge to the mainstreaming or normalizing of prostitution. It's not an attack on women and girls who are prostituted, nor is it an attack on men and boys who also find themselves in that situation. It's a critique of the institution, a critique of the power dynamics in that institution. When we talk about pornography, I've written extensively about this over the years, including a previous book, which is actually out of print because the publisher went bankrupt. Not as a result of publishing my book, I don't think, but other problems. That book is called Getting Off, and it's online for free at my website. A PDF of it is up. But this is another place where radical and liberal feminists often disagree. Again, looking at pornography as not simply the celebration of sexual freedom, which is what the liberal perspective tends to be, but in fact one more way that men buy and sell objectified female bodies for sexual pleasure. The radical feminist analysis points out that that system, that institution, is the problem, not individuals within it. And here I often point to what I call the paradox of pornography. That there are two things that are uncontroversially true about pornography in the period that I've been involved in this work, since the late 80s. These are things that no one would disagree with, whether you're talking to pornographers or critics. The first is the fact that pornography is more mainstream than ever before. Those of us in the room old enough to remember the trajectory of the pornography industry know it was once a marginal part of American culture. Now it's right square in the middle. Easily accessible, partly as a result of technology, but also because of social changes. Right? Affordable and easily used anonymously. Right? So pornography is more mainstream, more normalized than ever. By that I don't mean that everybody embraces and endorses porn, but that it is closer to the center of popular culture than it's ever been. What's interesting is that in the same time that pornography has become more normalized and more routine, the actual content, the images in pornographic films, have become more overtly cruel and degrading to women and more overtly racist. And so the question comes up, how do we resolve this paradox? Because in a civilized society, you would not think that a media genre would become more normalized, more mainstream, more accepted if it is also becoming more overtly cruel and degrading to women and more overtly racist. And resolving that paradox is very important. As is often the case, one resolves a paradox by realizing you made a flawed assumption. And you'll notice I said in a civilized society. And that may be, in fact, the flawed assumption there. But whatever, the radical feminist critique has identified these institutions, pornography, prostitution, stripping, the ways that objectified female bodies are routinely presented to men for sexual pleasure, and asked, are these consistent with a world in which we try to achieve gender justice? And the radical feminist answer is no. All right, I'm going to wrap up so that we have some time for discussion. To go back to my initial comments about, in a sense, what's in this for me? Right? As a man, why would anyone want to embrace a radical feminist critique of patriarchy? Because after all, let's recognize, patriarchy gives men, certain kinds of short-term material benefits. There are things I get as a result of being a man in patriarchy. Right? In the same way that, as someone who's white, there are things I get from being white in a white supremacist society. There are things I get from being educated and comfortably in the middle class in a capitalist society. There are things I get from being an American-born citizen of the U.S. in a world dominated by U.S. power. So, in a sense, the question might be, if one wanted to be crass, I argued it's in my self-interest, but is it not the case that my own self-interest might be in embracing these systems of unearned privilege and power? After all, there are certain goodies that come my way as a result of it. So here's the way I would challenge that. I have a choice, it seems to me. I can be a man, and by that I mean be a man in the way that patriarchal masculinity defines me. I can embrace what it means to be a man in patriarchy. Or I can be a human being, but I can't be both. That if I embrace those norms of masculinity and the benefits that come to men in a patriarchal society, I will never be fully human. I will have surrendered some of my own humanity. And the argument is that whatever the short-term material benefits of being a man in patriarchy, it is never worth surrendering some of your own humanity. And if you think about it, that argument holds in those other realms as well. I could just as easily say, I have a choice. I can be white and embrace all that whiteness means in a white supremacist culture, or I can be a human being, but I can't be both, because to embrace whiteness in a white supremacist culture is to surrender part of your own humanity. I can be an affluent, reasonably affluent person in capitalism and embrace the ideology of capitalism, or I can be a human being. I can be an American and all of what's encompassed in that now pithy little America First phrase, or I can be a human being, but I can't be both. Again, this is what feminism opened up for me. First, a critique of the illegitimate power men hold in patriarchy, but then quickly pushing to ask questions about other systems of unearned privilege and power as well. To make it clear that any system that's based in the claims of some people to own other people, whether it's literally ownership as it was in history, or just the right to buy and sell in the contemporary context, that these are fundamentally illegitimate claims. Right? And it also, I see some of you looking a bit dour and down. It's kind of a heavy. So let's not forget, this is my upbeat ending. Let's not forget that we're leaving out one of the, probably maybe the most important relationship of domination, subordination. And that is, of course, the human claim to own the earth. Right? That in fact, at the core of contemporary culture is an idea that is literally insane. that we own the planet, right? Which is where I think religious traditions, whether they're sectarian or not, all help us remember that in fact the claim that we own the earth is particularly ludicrous when we remember the wisdom of the ages, which is, of course, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Right? The reminder that we don't own the earth, as the saying goes, the earth owns us. And a foundational reminder that claims of ownership are always pathological. Okay, that wasn't much of an upbeat ending. I lied. I don't have an upbeat ending. But what I want to do now is, for whatever time is remaining, and I don't know how the clock started running in terms of taping, so I'll look to Carolyn with the mic, and the floor is open not only for questions, but also for your own reflections. I'm happy to hear what's on your mind.
So thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for your presentation.
My name is Douglas Bauer, and I wanted you to comment on kind of the arc of feminism from, say, the 70s to the present. My sense in the 70s, there were large demonstrations on a regular basis, and then during the subsequent decades, as women's reproductive rights gradually eroded, there was very little pushback on that until, I think, recently with the Women's March that occurred. I'm overstating the situation, but I just wanted you to comment a little further on that.
Yeah. So I'm not a historian of the movement, but most of you probably have heard these terms: first wave, second wave, that sort of thing. So the first wave of feminism in U.S. history is connected to women's suffrage, winning the vote in 1920. The second wave connected to the larger movements, the social ferment of the 1960s into the 70s, which included, of course, a challenge to all of the major systems, not only in the United States, but worldwide, including a feminist challenge to patriarchy. The movement split into many different forms, went in different directions, but I think one way to understand it is that all of the feminism that was vibrant in the 1970s, for the most part, provided a very substantive challenge to power, in the same way that civil rights and black nationalist movements and Chicano national, all of those presented an incredibly sharp attack on the legitimacy of existing systems of power. And the system fought back. The system did its best to eliminate the most radical analyses, to co-opt the ones it could. And of course, we see that eventually the more radical analyses in all of these movements retreated, and a more palatable version, right, of the civil rights movement, of the feminist movement emerged. Right? And that's, in feminism, a product of what we call the backlash. There was actually a book written around 1990 about the backlash, how when women made gains in certain arenas, there was a pushback in others. Like any attempt to understand history, it's complex. But it's rooted in an understanding that systems of power don't give in immediately to principled challenges to their power. They fight back aggressively where they can, they adapt and mold where they have to. And so you can see that, I think, across the board on all of these movements. Certain gains were won, and we don't want to minimize those gains. Right? The world looks quite different today than when I was born in 1958, and I don't know anybody who wants to go back to 1958. Okay, there are people who want to go back to 1958, but nobody who claims to be in favor of real justice wants to go back. And the reason not to minimize those gains is because, of course, people struggled, suffered, and in some cases died for those gains. And when I look out at a classroom at the University of Texas, I realize that there are people there today who wouldn't be there 20, 30, 40 years ago. That said, the system has not given way to the more radical critiques of that power and pushes back. And that's, in some sense, the story of all struggles against this kind of illegitimate hierarchy. goes forward, it goes back, it's 2 step forwards, 1 to the left. It's hard to chart until much later when you can look back and make sense of it. But I want to go back to this notion that the core of patriarchy is about men's attempts to control women's bodies, primarily their reproductive and sexual power. And here we see where patriarchy has both a conservative and a liberal side. The focus of the conservative movement has been to control women's reproductive power, fighting back against gains made in reproductive rights. The liberal side of patriarchy has been aimed mostly at keeping women's bodies open for maximal sexual exploitation and use. Right? And it's important to see that while those appear to be opposing forces in other realms, in some sense they are simply flip sides of the same patriarchal coin and need to be resisted in a feminist movement.
Dr. Jensen, could you comment please on your sources? What are the feminist views of the Equal Opportunity Commission and the rights of women and LGBT and blacks in the Trump administration?
Well, I don't think anybody needs to be particularly perceptive to realize that on all of those fronts where there has been progress made, even progress that's well contained within a liberal framework. So the progress made, to the degree there was progress on some of these fronts in the Obama administration within a liberal framework, is going to be rolled back. And I don't have anything pithy to say in response except to point out, and this to some degree echoes what I think Meg was preaching today, is that there are going to be short-term struggles to defend important programs and rights. And those short-term struggles demand our attention and our energy. There are also long-term struggles to keep alive ideas about real freedom and justice. And those need to be preserved and defended as well. And where any one person puts one's energy depends largely on the idiosyncratic nature of who we are. Right? Everybody has a different set of talents and temperaments. For some people, certain political action is sensible. For others, it may be different. And the hope is that if people go where our hearts and our passion take us, there will be sufficient energy to both try to hold back the repression of the immediate moment that is undoubtedly coming, and also to keep alive a more, I think, inspirational sense of what the world could be. In other words, politics is always about the moment and the future at the same time. And part of the reason I wanted to write this book, The End of Patriarchy, is I wanted, in plain language, there to be an articulation of this in a way that perhaps could speak to men. So that's what I did.
My name is Luther Elmore, and my question concerns your comments on pornography. That is, some years ago I read that the single largest body of material on the internet was pornographic material. And so is that still true? And then what has been the internet's role in the acceptance and spread of pornography?
Yeah. So, of course, trying to get reliable statistics about the content of the internet is pretty much a fool's game. I'm going to make, though, a bold statement. There's a lot of pornography online. Right? The more important question is, what does that pornography look like? And of course, the other thing about the internet, there's some bit of everything on the internet. And so what we want to do in assessing the content of porn online is look at patterns. What's the dominant kind of material you see? And there, my comment that pornography has become more increasingly cruel and degrading to women and more overtly racist, I think, holds quite clearly. That as pornography has evolved from the material that those of us who are old enough to remember what in the porn industry they call the golden age, the 1970s, the material that Andrea Dworkin really originally analyzed when she wrote her first book on pornography in 1979, that material is quite tame compared to what's available today. That's not simply a function of internet technology. If there was no social space for that, it wouldn't exist on the internet. Right? The internet, however, has changed the way people use pornography. Right? I mentioned briefly what in pornography they call the AAA engine: accessibility, affordability, anonymity. In years gone by, to access pornography, especially graphic, sexually explicit, hardcore pornography, one had to go out, one had to pay for it. Today, at a computer terminal, it's easily accessible. You can find it often for free, and you can do it anonymously. And of course, it's also lowered the age at which people, especially boys, have ready access to pornography, which, not to put too fine a point on it, means that as we sit here speaking, all over the world, all over the country, all over Austin, there are boys as young as 6, 7, 8. They argue that the average age of first exposure to pornography for boys is somewhere around 10 or 11, but again, I'm cautious about these statistics. Whatever the case may be, there are a lot of young men whose sexual imagination, as we speak, is being formed to images of women being sexually degraded, to images of overtly racist sexual activity. And that is, I think, not hard to argue, reason for concern. So.
When we take a look at inequality, one of the things that came to mind is there is a measure of economic inequality called the Gini Index, and it has to do with an inequality in the distribution of wealth, and it's sufficiently important that the CIA tracks it for countries. I wondered, in your research, have you come up with any attempt, this may just be too multidimensional to capture, but have you seen any attempt to kind of characterize a degree of inequality in a patronymic society?
It's an interesting question. So the Gini coefficient is a rough measure of inequality in societies economically, and it's widely used. I know of no patriarchy index that will tell you how patriarchal a society is, and that might be in part because you can measure wealth, income, spending. It's kind of hard to measure the aspects of what it means to live in a patriarchal society. I illustrate this to the book with a quote from a friend of mine. We were working in the anti-war movement as the U.S., after 9/11, was about to invade Afghanistan. And you might remember that the Bush administration made the argument that one of the reasons for the U.S. to invade Afghanistan was to liberate the women of Afghanistan from these patriarchal structures. And of course, women struggle with patriarchy in Afghanistan. That's obvious. But many of us in the anti-war movement were less than fully convinced that George W. Bush was going to unleash the American military on Afghanistan to liberate women. But whatever the case, my friend in the anti-war movement said somewhat cynically, but I think it captures what we're talking about here. He said, "Wonderful, now women in the world have a choice. You can be feudal property," as women in certain parts of Afghanistan were reduced to literally feudal property of a husband or father. He said, "You can be feudal property in some parts of the world, or you can be a capitalist commodity in others, like the U.S. Right? And that's patriarchy. Again, sort of flip sides of the coin. Very different social systems, but both of them leaving women and girls at risk. And so, no, I know of no index. It would be nice to have a pithy little number, The only thing, if there were a patriarchy index, it would probably be the case that Scandinavia would come out looking the best. They always do. Those damn Scandinavians are always coming out on top on everything. Yeah.
I guess I thought Senate Bill 6 was pretty straightforward. Some were on one side, some were another. Is there more complexity to it than I'm understanding?
No, so Senate Bill 6 about who can use what bathrooms. I wrote a piece where I pointed out that Senate Bill 6 was not going to pass for the simple reason that the Texas business community and Speaker of the House Joe Strauss had already said it's not going to pass. And so it was an opportunity to talk about the underlying ideas behind it and where the conflict comes from. So I don't actually support Senate Bill 6. I also don't support the Obama administration's Department of Education guidelines on this as well. But it really goes back to the question of what I think is a fundamental confusion about how terms are being used. And that's the book itself, and especially the chapter on transgender politics, are trying to provide some clarity for that. So if you like, I can summarize that argument in 3 or 4 minutes. It might be helpful. Yeah? Okay. So the question I present in that chapter with 3 elements. The first is a question about biological claims. We make a common distinction ever since the 1970s between sex and gender. Sex is a biological category. Humans are a sexually dimorphic species. We reproduce sexually. There is egg and sperm. That is a biological reality. Some bodies produce one, some the other. Right? There is a small component of the human population born what we call intersex, with ambiguous sexual characteristics, either chromosomes, genitals, gonads, or secondary sexual characteristics. But that's a very small component of the human population and is not the trans movement. The intersex movement and the trans movement are quite separate. So sex is a biological reality based in reproductive categories, male and female. Gender is a different kind of term. Feminists started using it in the 1970s to point out that patriarchy asserts these very rigid gender norms as if they were dictated by biology. Right? So, women are passive and nurturing, men are aggressive and intellectual. That was asserted to be a fact of nature, a fact of sex, and the feminist movement said, no, those are gender norms. So gender norms are constructed by cultures. They're a product of history, and in patriarchy, a product of power. Right? So keeping those 2 ideas, sex and gender, in mind, I ask a question, and here I want to point out that the trans movement, trans is now an umbrella term for an incredibly diverse set of ideas and people. And so it's hard to even talk about trans or transgenderism as a unified idea, because it simply isn't. There's, all sorts of different perspectives. But in the book, I ask a simple question. If the assertion of the trans movement is that someone like me, who was born unambiguously male, I'm not intersex, if I make the assertion that I am actually female, that I'm actually in the category female, in the book I ask, what can that mean? Because I don't understand. As I understand modern evolutionary biology, that claim simply doesn't make any sense to me. To say that I'm male, but I'm actually female. The only thing that has been asserted is that somehow there can be a biologically male body, but a female brain. But the problem is neuroscientists will tell you there is no such thing as a male or female brain. So it doesn't, I'm not saying I'm trying to attack people who make that claim. I'm saying I don't understand the claim. Now, if someone who, like me, is born unambiguously male and says, I feel constrained by the gender norms of masculinity, and in fact, I feel more at home with the gender norms of femininity, that I can understand perfectly, in part because, like most people, I've had some experience like that. But if that's the claim, that it is about gender, then the radical feminist challenge is to recognize that those very rigid and repressive gender norms have a source, and the source is patriarchy. And that the more effective way to challenge those rigid gender norms is through a feminist critique of patriarchy. So in the book, I ask that question, what does the biological claim mean? Because I simply don't understand it. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I think a lot of people don't understand what's being asserted if that is the claim. If the claim is about gender norms, which means culture, politics, power, and history, then there's a feminist argument that I think is a more compelling way to understand the nature of the problem. And in the book, I also point out some of the concerns that even within the trans movement are raised about what is called either sex reassignment surgery or gender confirmation surgery, that quite extreme interference in the human body, hormones, chemicals, all sorts of things. Even in the trans movement, people think about and wonder and worry about the nature of that change in the human body and whether it's healthy in all sorts of certain ways. And that's really an expression of concern. And there's a much longer argument to be had, but that's the the case I try to lay out in the book. And I try to make the point it's not an attack on anyone who asserts a trans identity. It's a set of questions about the underlying ideology that is used to support the trans demands. One last thing real quickly. To the degree this is just about how people understand themselves, I don't claim the right to tell people how to understand themselves. Right? It's only relevant in public, in a sense, when there are public policy demands being made, when we have to figure out how the law is going to read. Then what might be otherwise a purely private and internal question becomes public, and then that's when we need to understand the basis for the public policies that are being claimed.
Hi, Meg Barnhouse.
Yeah.
I have a question and a reflection. As a radical feminist who is the mother of 2 sons who are now in their late 20s, I've thought a lot about masculinity, and I've thought a lot about gender and sex. I read your article that came out in the Dallas paper, and it seems to me that these questions that you raise are good ones and yet very, very painful ones for people in the trans community, and might be more naturally given to the people who are in solidarity of the trans community or in the trans community to have public discussions about, and that as a cisgendered white man with a lot of clout and power, when you just pose these questions in public, and you use words like incoherent, their reasoning is incoherent, it's kind of pejorative. And I think maybe to have a time when we can sit together or take a seat, shut up, and sit at the feet of some people who are trans and listen about these questions respectfully with humility and curiosity might be called for at this point. And my thought is, after having watched 2 boys grow up and having, dressed them in yellow, not told people what gender they were, not given them any guns until they made guns out of cheese and bread and whatever else, thought a lot about testosterone, how much that determines people's personality, behavior. They're wonderful men at this point, and they always were, but and having been a woman who had to take, as part of my pastoral counseling training, a lot of, are you more masculine or feminine? And the qualities, as you say, that were assigned to each were completely ridiculous and arbitrary. Seems to me that maybe there's some kind of a third thing. There's sex, there's gender, and then maybe there's an intangible something that is which gender do you feel?